All right, everyone, we are going to get started. Good morning. Thank you for joining, and we will begin. All right, so welcome to our latest webinar series held in collaboration with Pipp Horticulture and Vertical Air Solutions. My name is Elise. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications here at Fluence. Today, we are going to be talking about facility design when it comes to cannabis vertical farming, and we're going to look at this as an integrated approach. We are going to meet our panelists. I'm going to provide brief bios. Then each panelist is going to give a brief presentation on their area of expertise, and then we will end the session with questions and answers. Please feel free to submit your questions within the Zoom app. This session is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording on Friday that you might be able to share with your friends, or if you have to drop off a little bit earlier, you can see the full recording at that time. All right, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. So today we are going to be speaking to Michael, James, and Sean. So Michael Williamson currently serves as the Director of Cultivation for Pipp Horticulture, and he's also Chief Operating Officer at Catalyst BC, which is a legacy licensed cannabis operator and pioneer in the vertical farming space. So after graduating from the University of Central Florida with a focus on biology and neurology, Michael worked as a consultant for Bayer Healthcare Pharmaceuticals for 8 years, coaching and mentoring newly diagnosed multiple sclerosis patients. Recognizing the medical benefits of cannabis, Michael relocated to Denver, Colorado in 2009 and co-founded and operating Kind Love, an award-winning and vertically integrated medical cannabis company, which included 95,000 square feet of indoor cultivation, extraction, commercial kitchen, and retail dispensary, serving both the medical and the adult use market in Denver. In 2013, Michael co-founded Greenhouse Industries, where him and his team developed and patented several cultivation trays designed for various cultivation strategies that could be stacked, allowing cultivators to maximize their space on multiple levels, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So Pipp Horticulture acquired Greenhouse in 2018, and we will hear about that from Michael today. And then moving over to James. So James Cunningham is the founder and the driving force behind Vertical Air Solutions. He's a native of Santa Cruz and has pursued a career in cannabis cultivation his entire professional life. In addition to founding Vertical Air, he also is the founder of Fog City Farms, which is a farm that you're going to take a look at it today, which is a leading edge vertical cannabis farm located in Watson, California. When not tending to Fog City Farms and Vertical Air Solutions, James looks after his vineyard. James is married with 3 children and lives in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And last but not least, we have Sean Sangster. Sean has spent the past decade helping cultivators optimize their farms and grow facilities for maximized production and quality. His in-depth horticulture knowledge combined with years of hands-on growing experience has spanned both the commercial crop and cannabis production cycles, uniquely positioning him as an expert project manager with Fluence's horticulture services team. Sean holds a bachelor's degree in agronomy from Florida A&M University and a master's degree in supply chain management from Wayne College of Business in Nova Southeastern University. All right, so those are our panelists today. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Michael Williamson, who's going to talk a little bit about Pipp.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pipp, Pipp is a division, Pipp Horticulture is a division of Pipp Mobile Storage Solutions, and they're based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Pipp is an industry-leading provider of mobile vertical grow rack systems and maximizing cultivation space. With over 400 grow room installations in 5 countries, Pipp proudly serves the cannabis and traditional cultivators with the same expertise that forged its dominance for over 40 years in the retail industry. Pipp is made in the USA and factory direct, which allows clients to customize based on their needs and work directly with our in-house team of engineers with no distributor markups or wasted resources. Pipp works hand in hand with cultivators, architects, engineers, and investors to provide everything from design to supply to installation. So we're going to talk about some key factors to consider when making racking decisions. And the first one for me personally is cultivation intimacy and expertise. There's a lot of players on the market, and as an ex-owner operator in the space, oftentimes I found early in my endeavors that people were learning on my dime. And so there was people that were poising themselves as experts, And unfortunately, I was paying for them to learn how to kind of optimize spaces and learn the nuances of the industry. So having someone, a company that has people on their team like myself and others who really kind of have walked in your shoes, I think is critical, because we really understand the challenges that you face and can kind of help navigate you through some of those challenges and pitfalls. The other obvious key factor to kind of consider in a room like this is room dimensions. So not just length and width, but also ceiling height. And when it comes to length and width of a room, with anything, there's a sweet spot. You don't want to have too much working space that it's you're not maximizing your canopy. And you also don't want to short yourself on a working space as well, where you end up having efficiency challenges and workflow issues. The big one on ceiling height is sometimes we'll get people that inquire with us and they say, hey, I've got a 22-foot ceiling. And they fail to mention any kind of obstructions that they may have. And so when I talk about obstructions, I'm really looking at clearance height. So there could be things on the ceiling such as HVAC equipment and ducting, sprinklers, trusses, things of this nature. So it seems like an obvious one, but sometimes people overlook it. Another key consideration to be considering is working space. So when we look at this picture that we have here, I would refer to the working aisle or the main aisle as the aisle that's running perpendicular to your screen. And then the screen that's just the aisle that's straight ahead, I refer to that as a mobile aisle, movable aisle, or a floating aisle. And with the working aisle or the main aisle, you want to make sure that you get the width right, like we talked about, but make sure that it's not too little or too less, because you're going to be bringing equipment in and out of there potentially. And some of that equipment could include ladders, scissor lifts, rolling locking platform ladders, scaffolding. And so it's important that you make sure whatever the size of that equipment is, that you ensure that it can make the radial turns to get down your rows, as an example. Another thing for consideration is ADA compliance and also seismic compliance. So James and I are located in California, and we're kind of right in the epicenter of things. And so Pipp offers a low profile track that has an anti-tip feature. And even if you're not in a quote unquote earthquake zone, the truth of the matter is that everyone can benefit from an anti-tip track. It's not uncommon for people to monkey around on these racks, especially during the cleaning stages, especially if SOPs and expectations aren't set in place. And so, something that I've always said to my previous teams is I can always grow more plants, but I can't grow more people. So keeping your people safe is obviously priority number one, and protecting your investment. So the anti-tip feature is for everyone, not just people in seismic zones. Another key area for consideration is GMP compliance. And so Pipp has worked extensively in Canada through the Health Canada licensed producer system, and a lot of that has to fall into GMP. So making sure that the components that are used, qualify for that type of level of compliance. Another key consideration is, what is this equipment made of, or what is the material selection? So at Pipp, we use marine grade aluminum, stainless steel components, antifungal and antibacterial coating, and we make sure that everything is UV stable. So I know with some of the other trays in the market that people have seen in the past, they may yellow or crack or break over time. So we make sure that everything that we develop in-house is made for the long haul. And when you look at a room like this, it's quite clear that equipment integration is really key. So when you look at a room like this, you can see that this obviously is not Pipp and VAS's Influence's first rodeo. These guys have done dozens of projects together, and they've worked through the minutia details that allow for seamless integration, and also making sure that they're maximizing all of your cubic inch footprint as well. And then Elise, if you can go to the next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about tray selection. All right. So we've got 3 tray offerings at Pipp. The first top 2 are very similar. The main difference is one has 4 sides, the one on the left, and the one on the right has 3 sides. So the 4-sided tray is a 16 gauge powder coated aluminum that has antifungal and antibacterial properties in the paint. And this can be used either as an ebb and flow tray or as a drip to waste tray. You also see that there's an option for HDPE inserts. That's high density polyethylene. That's very comparable to like a cutting board that you may use at your house. And that allows a little bit of airflow under the pots and adequate drainage, reducing algae and things of that nature. The tray to the right is a 3-sided tray, and the drip to waste has a little bit more functionality there because the HDP inserts can actually be slid out. And what's nice about that is, let's say you're scouting your rows and you notice that you have possible thrip damage on a back plant. Instead of having to reach over or, it's an ergonomic advancement. And so you can just simply slide the tray out and bring that plant to you versus rubbing your chest or stomach on the front plants and then kind of trying to overreach for the plants in the back. The tray on the bottom is our ABS plastic tray. It has a Corad cap, which also has antifungal, antibacterial properties. This is one of our best-selling trays. It's, I think, a lot due to price. It's a bit more economical than the other trays. The other 2 trays up top, they have built-in hat channels that provide support underneath the trays themselves, and also have integrated threads so that the lighting can be bolted right to the tray. It really is kind of a one-and-done tray, where the ABS tray, like most trays, has a grid system underneath it that gives it its support, which is a separate component. All right, and then lastly, this isn't really a PIP offering, but I wanted to touch base a little bit on some of the drainage strategies. So Elise, if you can go to the next slide, we're going to talk about some different options that some of our clients have elected. So as you see, if we take a look at the bottom 2 hexagons first, and I'll start with the bottom right one, you'll see a black little tip at the very top there. That's your male plug adapter, and that's coming from the bottom corner of the tray where all the water would funnel to. You'll see that it's just simply placed inside of an oversized female PVC pipe. That PVC pipe is supported by an all-thread material and brackets that are supported from the underneath supports of the tray, and as well as mounted to the carriage rack itself. The all-thread allows for the users to create a gradient and allows for a gravity slope out. So now if we shift our attention to the bottom left hexagon and imagine that pipe is just sticking out from the right hexagon, you'll see that there is a pipe that sticks out and it hovers over an open trough. And so again, it's gravity fed, and no matter which placement that the tray is in, it can drain into this trough. There also are closed trough options that work with flex hosing. And if we kind of jump our attention to the top left hexagon, I would say this is more of an ideal situation for someone who's doing a ground up build that has the ability to put in drains where they want drains. And so you run a trench drain perpendicular to the length of the rows at a strategic point, and you funnel the water from both sides of the length of the tray, and it hovers again over an open trough. So no matter where the tray is placed, it always has the ability to drain. And because we can create our mobile aisles, you can create open space to service the drains, clean the drains, things of that nature. All right, and the last hexagon on the upper right-hand corner, this was a really creative design that a client came up with, and they didn't have the ability to have drains in their space, and so they went with a bolted-on sub pump, and it has an emasticating ejector system essentially. If you're familiar with an emasticating toilet, it kind of runs on the same principles. So water funnels into this this catch, and then it is ejected up and out, and that can go into a reservoir outside the room or maybe to a drain that they may have outside the room. Now, generally, your plumber is who's going to install this stuff. This, like I said, isn't necessarily an offering of PIP, but our engineering team will work with your plumbers and your engineers to kind of troubleshoot through some of this stuff and also provide some examples of what other clients have done in the past.
Great, thanks, Michael. And James, if you would turn your video on and talk a little bit about vertical air solutions.
Hi, my name is James Cunningham, founder and CEO of Vertical Air Solutions. We are a air circulation, filtration, CO2 delivery company out of Santa Cruz, California. And we were developed in my farm, Fog City Farms, in 2017. So our technology involves a laminar airflow system that pulls through a filter and distributes air throughout the canopy tier to tier in the vertical space. The system is Kynar coated, which alleviates any potential for rust or corrosion in the indoor farm, which can consistently be exposed to high moisture levels and from spraying and transpiration and evaporative properties throughout the space, as well as UV damage and resistance that comes along with the powder coating and Kynar coating as well. So in getting into this space, I realized instantly that we essentially are creating a big cube within the farm. And historically throughout the space, throughout the cannabis, indoor horticultural platform, we have been able to control our environments very easily through oscillating fans, strategic supply over a single tier canopy. What the new platform did was create barriers throughout the space. So essentially you're creating 2, 3, or 4 canopies within one room. So essentially this is a cube that you're supplying your environmentals to, but how do you get those environmentals supplied to the inside of this cube, and how do you provide adequate air circulation tier to tier? So Elise, you can go to the next slide, please. So number one thing on the list for us as farmers was risk mitigation. So, you can have equipment failures, you can have over fertigation, you can have power outages and various things. So how do you mitigate pest pressures throughout this entire process? And what is the main contributor to making sure that everything works within the farm? That is creating a consistent environment, in my opinion. So right off the bat, we looked at how to control the microclimate tier to tier, and we set out to build a solution in vertical air solutions. And the biggest contributor to lack of production in the cannabis space, in my opinion, is powdery mildew. How do you combat powdery mildew? You combat that with air circulation and strategic supply of conditioned air and less humid air to the space. It's very difficult to do when you have barriers throughout the entire space. So what we do is supply our dehumidified air towards our mixing chamber, which is filtered and balanced, supplied tier to tier, and distributed vertically in a laminar delivery, so that we're not spreading pathogens throughout the entire space. The same thing goes for botrytis, which is better known as bud rot in our industry. This is a mold that usually takes hold on the inside of your flower towards the end of the round. In the close proximity space, when you're shrinking that distance from light to canopy and canopy to the next tier, it's very easy to create microclimates. And in these microclimates, you can have high humidity levels, which will translate into interior mold damage and botrytis, which essentially can knock out your entire crop. Again, horizontal airflow and lack of air through the space will create this and also spread this in a way that can knock down your entire production. And the same thing goes for inhibited transpiration. So farming on the Central Coast and farming in less than ideal indoor environments throughout our career, led us to understand that when your plants, when the vapor pressure deficit is off in your room and your plants aren't able to transpire, that leaf surface and leaf tissue will degrade dramatically, and that makes it much more susceptible to other pathogens. Vertical air solutions alleviates this issue to make sure that your transpiration rates are regulated and plants are producing adequately. Next slide, please. So, a similar approach towards risk mitigation. We want to create a consistent environment to make sure that we have a consistent approach towards battling pathogens and pests. The same thing goes for production. When you look at the indoor space, the indoor vertical space, first and foremost, many times you see this very consistent delivery of light, especially with the vertical farm, right? You need this in the close proximity space. The intersecting lighting patterns are very close. So you get the most consistent production of flower per square foot in any indoor platform. We wanted to create the same thing for our environmental controls and delivery. We want the most consistent environmental control per square foot available in the farm so that we can create the most consistent development. So we supply strategically to our mixing chambers, and we supply strategically to our canopy to create consistency throughout the entire space to get reliable production so that we can have a reliable product. Next slide, please. Operational efficiencies. So, you know, what led to us developing this vertical platform was the advent of high intensity, but much more efficient LED lighting. So essentially we get 2 lights for every 1 that we used to have in the HID space. The same thing goes for all the other implements. We have racking that makes things more accessible and makes the use of our square footage more efficient. With vertical air solutions, we have 1 fan covering the space that used to take 20. So even if you know those 20 fans ran at half the amperage or a quarter of the amperage of our 1 fan, you're still using 40 to 60% less power. And from an OpEx perspective, that translates into huge savings in the long run. So less fans, less circuitry, and again, very strategic supply of that airflow, balanced even supply instead of very high velocities that die off into high velocities that die off, and creating more inconsistencies and more microclimates. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And if we could turn it over to Sean.
Awesome. Thanks, Elise. Hello, everyone. My name is Sean Sangster. I am in the Horticultural Service Department with Fluence by Osram, and I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about LEDs and a vertical setup. Next slide, please. Awesome. So we'll jump through the presentation outline. We'll talk about lighting, some factors to consider. Then we'll talk about spectrum and intensity and how these factors affect cannabis production, especially in a vertical setup. And then we'll finish off with some lighting specs. We'll touch on some installation and integration. Next slide. Awesome. So some factors to consider here. As a grower, we are operating in a vertical space. Just like any equipment in that space, you're going to want to qualify things that you want to make sure that the equipment will work in the space optimally. So some things to consider when you talk about lighting is heat, uniformity of that light onto the canopy within those spaces of a vertical farm, your production strategy, depending on the genetics that you're going to be running in the space, or your strategic approach to the space, how lighting is going to affect that, the different spectrums and how they play a role on your plant production, your DLI, intensity is something to consider. We are in close proximity to plant canopies, dimming capabilities. You want to make sure that you have flexibility to manipulate your lights when you're in an indoor environment, and then daisy chaining, or what we call here at Fluence, flex wiring. Next slide, please. Awesome. So we'll jump into spectrum and intensity, and we'll talk a little bit about how these factors will affect cannabis production in a vertical setup. Next slide. Good deal. So as you can see here, what I have displayed are some typical spectrums that you see from a lot of the lighting fixtures that we have in the horticultural space. To the top left, we have a narrow band, or what you see of a purple LED. We also have the HPS spectrum. And then down below is what we offer for our indoor cultivators, which is what we call our PhysioSpec Indoor by Fluence. And some things to consider as you're growing in a vertical farm is, how spectrum is going to play on this morphology. And so, what we know with plants is that when you have a higher blue ratio compared to the other spectrums along the scale, we'll get a shorter morphology. As well with our spectrum here, our PhysioSpec Indoor, you see a lot of green as well. And so that allows for deeper penetration of the photons within a canopy. So when you're in a vertical farm, you usually see a lot of high density planting spacings. And so, when you have your plant canopy very tight, it's important to have a spectrum that can, not only just excite the photoreceptors at the top of the plant canopy, but that also make it down deeper within there. And then also what we know today to be true is that broad spectrum lighting also allows for high ppfd growing of cannabis without those usual issues that you see from other different sources of lighting that cause photo bleaching. Next slide, please. We'll talk about some key lighting specs. Next slide. Good deal. And so, when you're talking about an indoor growing situation, you want to make sure you're working with the lighting vendor that can provide you with these specific specs. And so, like Michael alluded to and James alluded to earlier in their parts, we work on a lot of projects together. We know each other's equipment very intimately. And, when you're working with a lighting vendor, it's good that your lighting vendor is also, working with your vendor partner when it comes to either space mobilization or air delivery to the canopy. And so as you can see here, these are some of the specs that we would mock up for some of our customers that are interested in multi-layer vertical farming indoors. Next slide, please. And then I also want to talk about the daisy chain system, or what we consider our flex wiring. And so you also want to work with a vendor that, can provide the diagrams and not just, a manual where it just says, put A into B and B into C. No, we actually want to see something that I can hand over to my contractors, right, who are actually installing this, and they can have a diagram where they can understand, how this installation can be installed and integrated within the equipment in my room. And so to finish off the presentation, we're going to talk about integration. And so what I want to do is bring back the other two speakers here, and so we can dive a little bit into how our equipment marry with each other.
Great, thank you, Sean. All right, so Michael, if you will start us off walking us through this facility from the facility overview, then into the writing.
Okay, sounds great. Welcome back, guys. So we're looking at a 3-tiered veg room with the integrated Pipp Fluence and vertical air technology. A couple things to note here. You'll note that there are not lights on the 3rd tier, and some operators have elected to take this approach because vertical farming offers a very unique alternative to kind of traditional phasing. And so where most people think of phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3, and I assure that most of you all have, these phasing plans. A lot of people think of that as a horizontal phasing. And in places like California, or if people are cultivating in major metropolitan areas, your square foot of real estate is expensive, and everything you can do to mitigate some of that risk is advantageous to your bottom line. So when some people consider phasing in a room like this, they say, okay, well, for phase 1, I only need 1 tier or maybe 2 tiers of veg. And for my phase 3 expansion, I need 3 tiers. Instead of creating a whole new veg room, you can actually pre-plan for some of this stuff. And so the phasing is actually more of a cubic phasing approach. And when planned appropriately, you know, if your electrical distribution is there in place from the beginning, you may not have to put all the HVAC allowance in there, but you may want to consider building a curb for the future HVAC and kind of having all that prepped. But if you do the work up front, and I do recognize that there is a CapEx associated with doing some of this preemptive work, but when you go to phase 2, you can literally go to phase 2 in like 3 days. It's as simple as installing VAS in some cases, and installing a light and plugging it in. And so what does that mean from a cultivator perspective? As a kind of an ex-cultivator, for the 10 years I was growing cannabis, I was under construction for 7 of those 10 years. And I know that there's some people on the other side of this screen that can associate with the pains associated with having construction workers in and out of your space, biosecurity contaminants, and it can be quite frustrating. So here is an alternative solution to phasing that doesn't involve any additional construction, doesn't involve any permits in most cases, and can be executed over the weekend. So pretty powerful stuff. And from a Pipp perspective, you just want to make sure that you're sizing your rack appropriately. We've had several cultivators who are like, hey, I'm just really comfortable with 1 level for right now, but I'm going to get comfortable with these new lights, and then I'm going to go to 2 levels. So we do see that deployment quite often, actually. Let's see, what else are we looking at in this room? So we've got our bulk rack mobile carriages. They allow for a movable aisle. When you have a room that's this large, we generally will recommend that your mobile aisle be sometimes as high as 72 to 96 inches wide. And the reason for that is it allows you to create multiple access points within the aisle. So let's say you're doing a defoliation task or an IPM release of biologicals or something of that nature. You can start 2 teams on opposite ends, create their own aisles, and then work your way to the middle, or start in the middle and work your way out. It's also an interesting way to kind of check the efficiencies of your workers. You know, if you start workers on a team of 2, let's say on 1 row on the right side and 1 row on the left side, well, who got to the middle first? And then you can kind of look at the quality. And sometimes you can have the faster team train the slower team and kind of help, you know, all ships rise in the tide, so to speak. So the box that you see in the middle with the Pipp logo, that is our mechanical assist drive system. And so this allows for operators to roll and move the multiple rows at once. And so you don't have to like go and crank each one. You can actually roll 3 or 4 of them at a time, sometimes up to 5, depending on kind of what the weight loads look like. My 3-year-old can roll these. So it's pretty impressive when you look at kind of how seamlessly and how easy these things move. The trays are a little bit washed out in this image, but the tray here is the drip to drain tray with the HDP inserts. We talked a little bit about how it gives more of an ergonomic availability to kind of slide plants in and out, especially in the veg stage or pre-trellis staging. This tray supports a wide variety of cultivation substrates, so everything from soil pots to cocoa bags to rock wool blocks or blocks on slab. Again, the irrigation is a little bit washed out here. This isn't something that we provide, but you know, the irrigation setup pretty straightforward. You see that little yellow circle that Elise just highlighted. There's some red flex hose. It's an industrial hose, generally provided by Dram or a company to that nature. And it has just enough allowance so that it moves with the racks. And if you kind of take a look at the upper left-hand corner with the electrical distribution that feeds to the racks, they also have that same amount of allowance. So as the rack moves, it rolls with. And then the irrigation in this case, you know, you've got a main supply line. It's then got punched in emitters that regulate the water. Those emitters go to spaghetti lines. Those spaghetti lines are attached to drip irrigation. Those drip irrigations go into the substrate. On the drainage note, you know, what's really nice about how water flows out of these systems is it's all gravity fed. So the top tray feeds into the bottom tray feeds into the lowest tray, and then that very bottom tray feeds into the drainage like we talked about in the first slide. Okay, next slide. I think this one's on you, Sean.
Yep. So we'll talk about here the spider fixtures that we have displayed. As you can see, our form factors and the different bars and the spacings that we have a lot for the vertical air solutions to push through, as well as fit the space of the racking of the mobile rackings 4x8 or 4x4 or wherever it may be, what the run is. And so our design, fits right in there, and then it also allows for the grower, as you can see here on the sides of the racks, where we have these controllers where we can dim up or dim down, where obviously daisy chained in here, and each of these controllers would control an entire rack. And so it gives the cultivator, or the team that's operating this, flexibility to adjust depending on the cultivars that are in these spaces. Next slide. That one looks like it's yours, Mike.
All right, Sean, we're just talking about the uniformity here and how it mounts into the AAS system.
Nice. Yep, I see that circle now. Yep. And so, like I said before, our fixtures are designed to fit into these mobile racks. We've worked with Pipp. We've worked with them for a long time, and we understand the indoor vertical farming space. And so, even with this design, and we'll show you with some later pictures how you can adapt our lighting fixtures depending on, if you're going 2 tiers, 3 tiers, if you're going to have a static roof where you want to not have a lighting fixture move with the racks, but static on the roof, but still, penetrate down. We'll show that in later slides as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. James, over to you.
Sure. So as you can see here, our air delivery system, the ports fit directly between the light bars on the fluence lamps here. We had a strategic approach towards that in order to deliver that same consistency of airflow that you see from these lamps here. As you can see on the mixing chamber there, you can see just a bit of that barbed fitting, which is your CO2 input to inject CO2 into your airflow so that you can have enriched CO2 concentrated air as your room is saturating. Gas spreads relatively quickly in the space, but just like conditioned air, it has a difficult time breaking through barriers. So strategically supplying that CO2 into your air circulation system will keep your CO2 concentrations adequate tier to tier. Another thing that I'd like to mention here is that Pipp does offer installation of our system. So as you can see, this is quite a large room here. There's a lot going on, and integrating the installation of our product into the rack installation is a huge offering from the integration of these two companies, given that in other scenarios, it's very common that someone else on the team is going to be installing it, given that it's an owner install product. One last thing that I'd like to mention here is you see that there's a filter housing. If you look down the line at all these plenums, that filter has multiple strategic, and it has a varied source of implementation here. So we've got, first and foremost, filtered air to your canopy, right? So everything that comes through that fan is filtered before it reaches the tier. And you'd be surprised how much sediment gets caught in that filter, even in the cleanest of rooms. So we recommend, switching out those filters at least every round. But another huge benefit to the presence of that filter is the balancing of our system. So when you have a source of airflow coming from one fan and you are distributing that air into 2 ducting runs, the direction of the fan is going to make the air favor one side rather than the other. So you're going to get disproportionate pressurization on one side of the system in comparison to the other. So we figured out throughout the process that putting that filter underneath the fan takes the direction of the fan out of it and allows for even diffusion of the air into both ducting runs and better pressurization and balancing front to back. So you can have a single fan, as in this veg solution, that will add a less than a 3 CFM variance front to back in airflow. So we also have other configurations as well for any velocity that you would want to achieve in this space. So.
Hey James, would you mind highlighting the CO2 distribution component as well?
Right. Yeah, I touched on that in the beginning. That here with that barbed fitting, that you can run. You go to your local CO2 provider. You can run a hard line plumb CO2 line into your room, much like you see your electrical drops here going to each space, or your irrigation drops going to each rack. You can have a CO2 drop coming to each rack, which would supply each plenum with enriched CO2 to provide adequate CO2 concentrations to each canopy. So this is actually Fog City Farms here, and this is my stellar family and crew here working on our canopy. We've been doing this for a long time, and these guys have been with me every step of the way. As you can see, the canopy maintenance and canopy production is super consistent in this platform. You have, the distance between any two lamps is the effective intersection and delivery of light to the canopy. So we try to get within that, 6 to 12 inches away from the light zone, which really shrinks that distance from light to canopy and deck to canopy, we call it, or from the bottom of that tray to the canopy. This shrinks that shrunken volume of air makes it very easily affected by transpiration and evaporation. So one thing we noticed very quickly in the process is that the humidity levels on the bottom tier were much harder to control than the top tier. So in developing vertical air solutions and supplying our dehumidification to make that air more available for our system, we were able to maintain consistent humidity levels top to bottom. The CFM generated by the fan alone is able to keep up and create a consistent temperature top to bottom. But that transpiration rate is so fast underneath, and you want to push that, right, for production and to maintain plant health, that supplying to all edges of this cube was not adequate enough in controlling our microclimate on the bottom tier. So vertical air and the strategic supply of dehumidification alleviated those concerns. You can see that we have our power drops, our irrigation drops, and CO2 drops all on the front side of this racking carriage here. All of those things run parallel into the space and move freely as we can create our 4.5-foot walkway anywhere we need to. That creates unbelievable accessibility 2 feet in from each side, which the racking carriage allows for here. And one of the big things getting into the LED space, even years ago when LEDs first started making some headway, was that workflow was going to be an issue because in order to achieve these light intensities, you have to get much closer to the canopy than we did with HIDs in the vertical farm. And I used to say, man, you're gonna have to really just like blanket this canopy in light in order to get adequate light intensities. That's what this platform has achieved. And so we're getting 2 lights for every one and unbelievably consistent production here.
Great. Well, thank you, James, Michael, and Sean. So we'll take this time now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to enter the Q&A session of this presentation. All right. So we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. For the audience sake, just to let you know, we are going to exceed the hour given how many questions are coming in right now. And so if you're able to hang on and work with us, that's great. But I'm going to start now. We've got technical questions for each manufacturer, and then we also kind of have full design questions. And so, Michael, I'm going to ask you the first question here about second layer or third layer. So some people are asking, is there a recommended amount of height, at least maybe a minimum height between layers? Can you talk about that as you go up?
Yeah, with cultivation, and obviously depending on the crop, we're talking about cannabis today, but with any crop, there's not a silver bullet answer, but we have some cultivators that are anywhere from 3 levels on a 12-foot rack, which is obviously very tight. More of a sea of green style, generally no topping. Specific cultivars are being grown, short veg times with a pretty early flip, and but I think the safe buffer zone is generally somewhere between kind of 4 and 6 feet. But we see a lot of people kind of right in that 5-foot marker.
Okay, and I know you talked a little bit about irrigation beforehand, and so what is a limitation for someone other than, of course, ceiling height? But when should they consider maybe too high is too high?
In terms of irrigation, or I'm sorry?
I guess all factors leading into it, but we did have one specific to irrigation. How do you irrigate a third layer?
Oh, okay. I mean, at the end of the day, I think you're going to be automating most of that stuff. So that should be automated. There's this thing with cannabis growers, especially legacy growers, that they think they need to be in their room all the time. They got to touch their plants. And I'm a big advocate for walking your rows and inspecting your plants and getting eyes on things and tracking data. But this whole, I need to be with my plants. The word grower is kind of a funny word, the plants grow themselves. They're the grower. So I find that, if we can automate, especially with new technologies, as much of this stuff as possible, it reduces a lot of human risk and just saves time and money.
That's good. And James, in your farm, how are you managing labor on those multi-levels?
We're using ladders on the second tier. I leave that up to, much like the construction space, there's a certain height that enacts a requirement for accessibility. In a lot of farms, the third tier will require some sort of lift or required access. And at 2 tiers, under 12 feet, a ladder is all that's needed. And at our farm specifically, platform ladders and regular ladders are all that we need.
Great. Hey, Sean, I have a question about lighting here. So can you have multiple light schedules in the same room? And how do you achieve this on this multi-layer racking?
So having multiple light schedules in the same room, yeah, that's possible. But you have to ask yourself what style of production you want to run. Most guys, separate their veg, separate their moms, separate their flowers, all because all of these plants are dependent on a different photo period in order to maintain the stage that they're in. And so, it's all dependent upon what you want to do. But yes, our lights do have the flexibility to do that.
And regarding lighting, we've seen 2 different photographs primarily in the facility design. Can you talk about just briefly the different stages and what you need to consider with lighting between all the stages of your growth here?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I touched on it at the end of mine, where we were talking about, the different styles of how you can hang it on the mobile racking. And then you saw it on James's last picture where he had on his second tier, the Vipers, where they were static. And, James, if you want, can you touch on that for us here? Where, how does that work for you, those static lights, and how are you seeing the uniformity?
Sure. So when we were getting into this space, we didn't really have any models to go by, right? So we were used to the single layer platform, which has a greater distance from light to canopy, and that's a more forgiving platform. So from a flowering perspective, we were seeing some success with the static lighting in the Vipers in the with I think it really just had to do with our normal practices and that falling in line with what we were used to, and then environmental controls, right? As we develop vertical air solutions, and really started to figure out the dynamics on the lower platform, our production started to go up, down low. And I think that really that's just a more consistent delivery of light. And you really kind of have to break it down to square inch, in comparison to square foot up there, because in my experience, that delivery of light is most effective below the lamp at the same distance as those lamps are apart, right? So you have a larger window up top to maintain those adequate light intensities, and cannabis is a very high light intensity plant. Down low, you have a smaller window, but once you really dial it in, you can push production higher down low, even though sometimes it looks deceiving, like you may not have as much. So going forward, we will have the same configuration as we have down low on every tier, much like that other picture you saw in the veg at Nature's Remedy, in the picture that Michael was picking apart there. But yeah, we've had great success on both platforms, and it's been an unbelievable learning curve. So.
Nice. Is there any spillover that you see from those that are on top to the canopy below?
Not when they're in the resting place, but yes. So we added an extra row of lighting over the walkway on the top tier, so that when we're working and we're needing to create an aisleway on the inside of that cube, that everything is still having adequate light on the outside. So we do have, actually I shouldn't say that. There's no spillover on the bottom tier, but the intersecting lighting, from tray to tray is definitely noticeable.
And James, you brought up a good point too that we didn't really touch base on, and you coined it as the resting position, sometimes called the home position. And so I want to take a moment to highlight that for some of our participants. So when you're not in the room, and when we looked at the picture that we were kind of breaking down earlier, you saw that all of the racks were, they were tight, they were, butt to butt, so to speak. And so when they're in the resting position, you create gaps. So you take your big main aisle and you spread it out throughout each rack. And so you'll create anywhere from a 6-inch to sometimes up to a 12-inch gap in between each row. This also helps homogenize the room as well. And like I said, we're really striving to keep people out of the room. So 90% of the time, the racks are in the resting position or the home position, which kind of help airflow from multiple tiers in addition to the BAS.
Right, by utilizing thermodynamics in the space, basically.
Okay, that makes sense. And I do have a question from an audience member asking about temperature here. So if airflow is near the LEDs, kind of on the picture that we saw prior, this person is asking, is it going to cause the temperature increase, given that the design, the light, the heat source might be a bit closer to the airflow? Have you seen that before, James?
No, actually, I'd say vertical air helps in keeping the temperatures of the lamp cooler.
Okay.
As well as your canopy. So your leaf surface temp. Your leaf surface temp is very important, and getting that consistent delivery of air helps maintain adequate leaf surface temp so that you alleviate burning and other issues like that.
Okay, that makes sense. And I have a question about plant production. And so have you seen, plant morphology look a little bit different on the second layer than you see on the first layer? Are there any differences that you see between the plants?
There are some different characteristics on the top tier that can be more similar to a single tier HID room, right? Okay. Because it's a more intense lamp per square inch than the lamps on the bottom. This is my interpretation of it. It's a less powerful lamp in its entirety, but it's more powerful per square inch. And so your intersecting lighting patterns can be fairly strong the closer you get to the lamp. So you can get that kind of striping in the space where you get large colas and bigger kind of production in those intersecting areas throughout the canopy. And maybe not, it's very consistent in comparison to anything else. But I'd say that lamp is really well suited for a greenhouse, and greenhouse production where you're having kind of like this light supplementation scenario. And whereas down low, I said earlier that it can be deceiving because we have just a much more consistent development sometimes even a slightly smaller size, but that means we don't have to break anything down going forward, right? So our smalls to usable flower is the ratios are much better down low, and the development is much more consistent. So it can be a little deceiving. You look at the flowers down low and they seem slightly smaller, but it's more consistent front to back. And up top, you can have these kind of more dramatic intersecting lighting patterns where your light intensities raise and lower and raise and lower. And the development can take on those same characteristics of an HID room, where it's stretchy and big colas and everything's kind of trying to reach to get up to that light.
James, do you think that would be true if you were using the same lighting fixtures on both levels? Because you're using, kind of more the greenhouse style razor fixture up top. Do you think that would hold true if you were using the spiders on the top?
No. So going forward, that is going to be the configuration we use is spiders on every tier.
Okay. So we are approaching the hour. I want to tell everyone that if it's okay with you guys, we're going to extend this just by 15 minutes. But before we continue the Q&A session, I wanted to share my screen for those of you who might have to drop off. So thank you again to our panelists. We'll thank you again in the end. If you guys wanted to get in touch with either panelists or follow them on social media, here's all the information that you guys might need. I'll show this again at the very end of the presentation in 15 minutes. I will say there are a lot of technical questions that are coming through that are very specific to each of the products that we reviewed today. And so feel free, everyone here is on social media. If you go to the company social media from each company, you'll also be able to answer those questions directly with those vendors, just in case we don't get to your question today. So I'm going to leave that screen up for 1 minute for people who might need to grab information really quickly. And we'll move into a few more of these technical questions. And so let's move over to Michael. So Michael, we are getting some questions about capacity within your designs. And so can you talk a little bit about options that people might have and things they need to consider when they're building out capacity?
Yeah, are we discussing weight loads, or are we looking at plant densities? I know
actually people have asked both questions.
Yeah, well, they're relevant. So, as far as weight loads go, it's 1,000 pounds a linear foot, and the truth of the matter is unless you've got maybe some really heavy living organic soil beds, there's no way that you're going to put enough weight on these racks to even come close to exceeding the weight capacities. Oftentimes when people are buying traditional bulk rack, like what you would see at a Home Depot or a Lowe's or a Uline, it is way overkill for the needs of these plants. And so we work with a marine grade aluminum, and it's a lighter gauge, but by no means is it flimsy or lacking strength. As far as plant densities go, a common theme that we see with cultivators, and no two cultivators are quite the same, but James, you're at 36 plants per tray, is that right? A little over like 0.9 plants per square foot, roughly. We see a lot of people that are also at 1 plant per square foot. But there's other people that will double down and, grow smaller plants like we talked about earlier in more of a sea of green style. And they could be anywhere from 64 plants for a 4x8 tray and things of that nature. As far as capacities go on our rows, without additional approval from our in-house engineering team, we can go as high as 23 feet on our racks. Not to say that that's the limit, we just have to get a few more approvals. And we can go as long as 56 feet without any additional approvals. And once you kind of get over 50, 60 feet, you start to get into a lot of different workflow inefficiencies. So oftentimes we have a really long room. We may have 2 56-foot racks that flank each other that have another secondary main aisle that meet them. We can also put the mechanical drive assist box on both ends so that if you're on the far end of the room, you can roll it. And if you're on the front side of the room, you can roll it as well. Oh, sorry.
No, I was on mute. While we're talking dimensions, James, the same question came for you about how long your units run. And so what can they expect for coverage?
Right, so we've run them up to 56 feet. And that's a very specific question for the user in their desired elevation, desired velocities, and desired use. So veg, flower, light choice, and all of those things will dictate the model that you get from us. And that's a case-by-case basis.
Okay. And then Sean, we've seen two different light fixtures in our case studies here. Will you talk a little bit about coverage area and mounting height, the importance of mounting height?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for us, the one that James is going to be switching over to on his top shelf is our Spider 2 series. And so with that, you can get anywhere between a 4x4 coverage of that, so 16 square feet underneath that. And then you can get as close as, 6 inches, anywhere between 6 to 12 inches to that, to the canopy without having any issues.
And then what about the Viper series? So we saw a different kind of top light look.
Right, and so with that form factor, that's going to be a little bit different. And so you can get anywhere between a 4x4 or 4x5 with that. And then with our newer series, we also have a bat wing that can actually reflect the light, and you can get it really close. You can get it closer to the canopy and spread that light more evenly. And so under areas where you have a lower ceiling, those are something that's ideal. So what you can picture that as is like the reflector as in an HPS or an HID type of setup, but for an LED.
Okay. So we've had a few questions from people about maintenance of these products. And so I'm wondering if I could hear from each of you about what people need to keep in mind when they're deploying in multi-layer about maintenance and long-term longevity of these technologies. And so I think starting first, I'll ask, in the Pipp system, which seems to take up the most area and hold the most plant matter, how often are you guys recommending cleaning of those designs, and what can you talk about maintenance there?
Yeah, well, maintenance and cleaning and sanitation they're all relevant to each other, but they're kind of separate buckets. So I'll start with cleaning. As far as cleaning goes, my professional opinion is that you should be cleaning your facility on a regular basis as you're making a mess, of course. And then the big clean would be post-harvest. So after the last plant's out, you're removing all the, depending on the particulate or substrate or whatever you might have, or leaves or decaying matter, hopefully not too much of that. But then sanitation is something that's different. And oftentimes when someone tells me that something is clean, I often find that it's actually not sanitized. So with something like racking that has lots of nooks and crannies, which the nooks and crannies can be really helpful because you can adjust this stuff yourself. And a lot of the adjustments are toolless or semi-toolless or simple tools. And so, but that being said, there are these nooks and crannies. So there's two products that I really like to use. One is a biofoamer and one is a biofogger. And so you can take products like Sanidate, Zerotol, whatever that product you may be using to sanitize your space. You can put it into the actual biofoamer. And the biofoamer, if you're not familiar with it, think of it like a paint sprayer. And what's nice about the foam is you can physically see where you've sanitized. Some people will use, water and pressure washers, but you end up making a big mess. And also you can't see where you hit. And so with the biofoamer, you can coat it. It's self-dissolving and doesn't involve a secondary rinse. And then once you're done with that, if you want to really take it to the next level, you can actually fog out the whole room with a biofog, which also doesn't need a secondary rinse either. And another component of sanitation is validating your sanitation. So oftentimes people say, oh no, it's clean, it's sanitized, but they've never validated their SOP. And so there's equipment and tools out there, 3M, like the adhesive, they make what's called an ATP machine, and it's basically a swab test. So let's say you cleaned and sanitized your room, you would then go in and have someone from QC go and swab certain components and make sure that it meets the level of sanitation that you're expecting it to. As far as maintenance goes, there's several simple components that may need to be maintenance from time to time. Tools like an Allen wrench for tightening up the crank maybe, or the handle on the mechanical assist drive. There is a chain similar to like a bike chain. Those may need to be tightened or replaced over time if someone's misusing the racks. But that's something that we have really great tutorials for and service for if anyone's in need of that.
Okay, great. James, I'm wondering if we can go next to you about your solution.
Sure. Yeah, we offer a maintenance guide for our solution. I'd say from an environmental perspective, you know, your first defense is making sure that all of your supplied air and everything coming into the space is sanitized, right? Because our solution is only going to be moving that air throughout the canopy. So,
Right.
so you want to make sure that everything coming into your space is sanitized and at the right environmental conditions. So you want to make sure that your dehumidification is in line in order to stop the growth of pathogens, right? Because a lot of these pathogens are systemic issues, but they have a hard time showing themselves and living on leaf surface or any surface at certain humidity levels. So that's something that we need to educate ourselves on as growers and figure out what those are. All of the air that we pull for a secondary line of defense, like I said earlier, that we pull out of the room is being filtered. So everything that goes through our system is filtered. On top of that, we are developing a UV sterilization unit. That's a passive sterilization unit that will calculate the cubic square footage of your room and figure out how many of these units you need in your room to cycle your room at an adequate kill rate and a adequate amount of exchanges per hour. So.
Great. I see that there's some trickling questions after that. I would ask you guys maybe to go on to VAS to ask that. We'll move on to Sean. Sean, anything that a cultivator should know about multi-layer production with lighting as it relates to maintenance?
Yes, absolutely. And so the first and foremost part that's very important when it comes to lighting is making sure that when you do clean the lights, they are operationally off. That would be one of the first things that I would suggest. We do provide a guide and a manual to talk about the different products that can be used on it, such as quaternary emollients. We know that that's used in the greenhouse space. Mike brought up Xylitol and Sanidate. We've tried and tested those also on our products, but even if those products aren't allowed to be used in your cultivation environment, then, you know, even with water that's, you know, not pressurized through a pressure washer, but just, you know, a finger over the hose where you can wash down the fixture is very important. And the frequency, I would say, would be dependent upon, you know, how often are you spraying in the room? How often are these chemicals getting in contact with the lighting fixture itself? You know, I see guys who are cleaning it after every turn or once a quarter. And so it really depends upon, you know, what you have going on inside your production space.
Great, thanks, Sean. All right, I'm going to move to, I think, one of our last questions, given the time. There are so many questions coming in, but of course, top of mind for everyone is yield. So how does this kind of growing strategy impact revenue, basically, your bottom line that comes in? And so we hear a lot of conversation about multi-layer production being a great way to increase your yield within a specific square foot. Can you talk to, James, kind of what you've seen in your experience and how this kind of design impacts your yield?
Sure. So I'll start with saying that I'd say we average 25 to 30% higher yields per genetic per square foot. But I want to say that very quickly this space is going to become a quality-driven market rather than a yield-driven market. So that's something that consistently comes up. But, you know, in California, for instance, in the most kind of developed market in the world, I can grow some of these very high producers and not sell any of it. But with that being said, we look at the amount of energy that we put into the space and how much product we're able to produce with that energy. So we have gone anywhere from 1 gram per watt up to 1.87 grams per watt. And if you look at 1.87 and use that as a, you know, with legacy technology, like an HID lamp, for instance, you're creeping up around, just for simple metrics, you know, 4.5 plus pounds of light, up to 5 pounds of light. So it's definitely a higher yielding platform. But again, I'm looking for flavor profile. I'm looking for the future of cultivation and what's more sustainable and what's more responsible for us as users, you know? But without a doubt, we are yielding more per square. I mean, think about it like this. In one of my rooms, I have, 87 lamps. I'd have 35 or 36 HID lamps in the same space. And we've gotten, a total weight, 120 something pounds out of there before. So, I mean, if you were going to look at that with a traditional setup, it's just not achievable. So.
Michael, do you have any comment on when someone is kind of looking some of the values of multi-layer and vertical farming? What have you guys seen in your experience?
Well, in terms of, value, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but in people that are producing in, major metropolitan areas or in expensive states like California, being able to maximize your cubic footprint is massive. And in terms of yield, let's say, I see a lot of operators and everyone does things a little bit differently. So we can't say it's the rack or the airflow or the lighting that contributed to it, because there's all these other informational pieces of the pie that go into these inputs. But in general, I see a lot of people between, I would say 40 and 65 grams a square foot on just a single level. And so if we look at the conversion of a 1,000-watt fixture to a Fluence fixture, which is in a 600-ish range, it's not quite a 1-for-1. You're at 1,200 watts roughly for the two tiers, but it's not far off. And so we get a lot of people that are converting over from legacy technology, single level HPS to this system. And so, if they're like, well, hey, I'm hitting 2 pounds or 2.5 pounds or whatever that might be for them per light previously, now, you're able to achieve the same thing, but not just on one playing field, but on a second playing field. And even on the low end of the spectrum, you're still getting significantly more out of that cubic, same amount of footprint that you were using. And so it creates a lot of value. And at the end of the day, this crop is unlike any other. And so if you can gain square footage of canopy, the ROI on it is dramatically, it can be first harvest in some cases when people really nail it.
Just to weigh in there real quick, a lot of the efficiencies in power usage comes from the close proximity platform and being able to use your dimmer and not run not run your lamps at full capacity sometimes until week 5 in the cultivation cycle. So the power savings that you get during those first 5 weeks is very noticeable. In the long run, like our power bill is definitely reflective of us being able to run lower light intensities, but run lower amperage, but gain the same light intensities throughout the first half of the round.
Makes sense. All right, you guys. Well, it is 12:15, so I'm going to end on one last question. So we've got some people in the audience who are thinking about going multi-layer, and Michael, like you just mentioned, are currently growing on a single layer. And we have some people who are thinking earlier in their planning cycle. They don't actually have a facility up and running yet, but they are looking to decide between single layer or 2 layers. So in your experience, if I could ask each of you, what has been one key thing that either you wish you would have done earlier in your design process, or now that after you've been using the technology, what should a grower keep in mind in their planning process? So Sean, can I start with you to answer this question, and we'll go to each person?
Good deal. One thing, just being in this industry for this time now, I would suggest for growers is to look at the future of what is going on in cannabis, right? Really pay attention to how we're, this active creation of, compounds that we're doing in this plant, and how your systems that you're going to be putting in place will affect the active creation of these compounds, right? And so whether it's, a two-layer system or a high PPFD approach, the breeders of today are working with, the geneticists of tomorrow. And, you're going to start to see a lot of these different cultivars behave in a way where, you can test the limits of you know, light intensity, airflow, and then you want to maximize your space. And so I would suggest to growers, you know, always look to that. And we're at the tip of the iceberg today. Imagine, you know, when we're 10 years down the line where we can get the cultivars that, you know, James likes, you know, that aren't running at 1200 ppfd, but, you know, 10 years from now they are, right? And so, and then they're producing, you know, 70 to 100 grams per square foot, then, you know, that's huge. So that's would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Sean. James, how about you and your experience?
You know, I'm figuring out that we can gain adequate production at closer proximities. So in the current configuration at Fog City, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be running the spider configuration on the upper tiers, which means I could potentially get 3 tiers under a 14-foot ceiling. So so in going forward, that's one thing for us to consider. And then you know, just workflow and configuration things are things to always consider when you're entering your room. What's going to be the easiest access point? How many times are you going to be turning corners? Other than power in these spaces and things of, you know, of that nature, workflow and labor is the #1 consideration.
Thanks, James. And Michael?
James is really good at this. He stole my idea. But no, you know, what I learned quickly in the vertical space was if I could accomplish 2 levels, that I could accomplish 3. We've seen people go as high as 5, but there is strategic planning and appropriate tools that are needed. I think if I could go back in time and, you know, I got started in the vertical farming space about 2013. I wish that there was consultants out there that were really educated in this space, and I would have hired them in a heartbeat. So, you know, I know that James, myself, and Fluence, they have various consultants on the team that can offer additional and more intimate kind of support. And so, you know, that's something that if you're going vertical for the first time with equipment that you're not familiar with, you should become very familiar with the 3 of us and our companies and our offerings.
It's a good way to end it. Absolutely. Okay, so let me share my screen one last time for all of you who are still tuned in. So thank you so much for joining. There are so many more questions to be answered, so we will be online and we'll be able to answer some of those questions for each of you on your social media channels. So thank you guys so much for your participation. I really appreciate your time, and you guys will hear from us again on Friday when the recording is available, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Awesome, guys. Take care.